Well, greetings. Today I'd like to talk about making the most of public investment management. And in doing that, I've got two parts to the presentation. The first part is really the macro part. It's the virtuous cycle of public investment, which is about investment, quality of capital, economic growth, and the effects on government revenue. The second part is more micro. It's about the challenge of efficient mobilisation in public investment management, which will focus on value for money, managing over the life cycle, the whole of government, and the differences between financing and funding. So the first thing to note about public investment management, and I think why we're really talking about it here at PEMNA, is that it is a cycle involving many steps. In this depiction, we have 8 steps, and that cycle, we want it to operate in a smooth, mutually cooperative, enhancing way. And that involves many players who need to coordinate and cooperate together. Someone needs to own the public investment management cycle. In some countries, it's Ministry of Finance. In other countries, maybe not. Whether or not it's the Ministry of Finance or someone else, budget and treasury are really central for engendering the coordination and cooperation required amongst all those players to reinforce that cycle and to get the commitment to a harmonious and successful process. Now, there is little debate, I think, internationally about the need and the desirability of public investment in infrastructure. The fiscal needs to achieve the SDGs have been estimated at nearly 5% of GDP for emerging market economies and 15% of GDP for lower income countries. The bank's own work on Beyond the Gap has estimated the closing the infrastructure gap will require between 2% and 8% of GDP per year by 2030. International agencies generally, particularly in the context of COVID, have pointed out that that action is really required. The international agencies are sounding a bit more desperate. The OECD says there's a need for speed. The fund has talked about preempting a legacy of vulnerabilities and pre-approving a set of tax reforms. And the World Bank, for our part, we lent more than $100 billion for the first time in fiscal 21. COVID has really highlighted inequalities, including inequalities associated with infrastructure services. Now, in that context, we want to have a look at how much fiscal space is there for government investment. Now, the way it appears, there's not much. There's high levels of government debt, particularly in low-income and emerging market economies. That was growing before COVID and has grown since. But interest rates, of course, are historically at very low levels. So relative to the stock of debt, it's actually left a bit more space than we would normally associate with crowding in some good spending. Of course, on the other hand, good spending is one thing, but we know from the work done at the bank and at the fund, there are often barriers to carrying out really good spending on public investment. So the fund has estimated that as a 40% efficiency loss in low-income countries, 27% in emerging, and 13% in advanced countries. So how should we think about all these aspects of the story? High level of debt, low interest rates, important to have public investment and infrastructure spending, but some deficiencies in the way that that's executed. So we've thought about that, and we've thought about how you might go about exploring, drilling down on this question. We asked the question about tax and investment. Really, it's a horse and cart story, and by that we mean what comes first, the horse or the cart? What comes first? Government investment leading to quality capital, economic growth, and boosting government revenue, or the constraints from government revenue, reducing the opportunities for government investment and correspondingly reducing the results in terms of quality of capital and economic growth. So one way of looking at this, it's a sort of a positive story about investment, capital growth, revenue growing, investment, etc. The other is a less positive story, which is about, well, maybe government revenue really means the fiscal outlook is constrained. We have to cut back, including in government investment. So let's start by thinking about infrastructure asset creation. Government investment dollars do lead to better quality public infrastructure, particularly in lower income countries, rather than slightly more than emerging markets. So the graph on the right shows on the vertical axis, the average output efficiency score, and on the horizontal axis between high income, low income, and middle income, for those cohorts, what that result is. And what that shows, with the blue line being the median level, is that high income countries typically have a high average output efficiency score, which is higher than low income countries, which is slightly higher than emerging market economies. So why are low income countries sort of higher than emerging market? We think the reason for that is the so-called decreasing economies of scale argument. The level of capital stock in low income countries is lower, which means the marginal contributions, the marginal gain from a dollar of investment is higher than when the capital stock to begin with is at a higher level. That's the decreasing returns to scale argument. There are small levels of infrastructure pre-existing in low-income countries. But the other part to the story is the degree that public investment crowds in or crowds out private investment. So down the bottom left-hand side, we have a graph which shows the effect of a 1% GDP point increase in government investment in total investment. So the grey line, the grey bars there, that's the total investment. The orange is the government investment. What that shows in low-income countries, total investment, the grey line, is more than 1% for a 1% increase in government investment. So that suggests that the amount of private investment crowded in low-income countries is particularly high. And this positive result, the graph on the top right and the graph on the bottom left, is despite the fact that there's typically worse governance in low-income countries. So that drags down the infrastructure capital efficiency ratio, but not enough to offset the favourable effects of the low-income capital stock and crowding in. Now, clearly, if low-income countries or any countries increase the quality of their governance and they get a corresponding increase in efficiency, that's an unambiguously positive result. So we've thought a bit about the returns, the government efficiency rate of public investment management across these income classes, how it might be influenced by efficiency. But can we think about how those different levels of efficiency, of quality of spending, may affect economic output? So here we have a look at the traditional growth accounting framework for looking at income growth as a result of capital and labour. The capital elasticity of output ratio, alpha, is given in the traditional way as 0.35, which means that for a 10% increase in the capital stock, there'll be a 35% increase in output. But the interesting thing we've done here is that we then discount the total capital investment or government by this efficiency score. So the bottom line shows that it's the sum of government investment discounted by the efficiency score, and then we add the private investment crowding factor. So what's the result when we apply this? We want to think about the effect of the capital spend on output, and then we want to think, remembering back to our horse and cart story, of the effect on revenue. So when we look at revenue, the impact of economic growth and development on tax revenue has certainly gone up in lower income countries, and the buoyancy, which is shown in the bottom left-hand side, the top blue line, it now exceeds that for emerging market and advanced economies. But the tax revenue as a share of GDP is lower in lower income countries. So that that suggests, even though the buoyancy is higher, the total is lower, so it's a percentage increase on a lower base. So then when we put this all together, we have a look at the government expenditure investment as a percent of GDP, the change in the capital stock, discounted to take effect of the efficiency factor, influences economic growth, which then feeds back into growth in government revenue. So on the right-hand side there, we look at what the effect is on individual countries. The dotted vertical line is at 1. So at 1, basically it means you get a free lunch. It means for every dollar you spend on government investment, you get it back in revenue. So for the 10-year period that we looked at this, Mozambique, Nicaragua, India and Ivory Coast came out above 1. Now you expect that to recede through time, partly because of decreasing returns to capital, but also the vagaries of what happens in public investment management in those countries. Then on the left-hand side, the blue bars for different country groupings. A few to draw your attention to: Sub-Saharan Africa, about 3/4 way down, South Asia, just below it. They have pretty good results in terms of clawing back into tax the benefits from spending. EAP is sort of in the middle, that's the East Asia Pacific region. And then very noticeable is the fragile states and the oil-rich states, which basically get back almost no revenue from increased capital spending. So what are the main points then as we draw to closure on part 1 of my talk today? It is that government revenue creates space for investment, and investment boosts revenue. So it is a virtuous cycle. The size of the impact depends a lot on the size of the initial capital stock. Crowding in and crowding out of private investment is also very important, as we saw, as is revenue performance and buoyancy. Governance and spending efficiency matter, but can be offset by other factors, particularly the stock factor associated with capital. Lower income countries do tend to do well, but weak tax systems can handicap the revenue response to their investment. And PIM, public investment management systems and governance, do remain critical, but they need to be set in the broader context and the consideration of space for investment and infrastructure needs. So that's really the end of part 1. In part 2, we want to drill down on the micro cycle, virtuous cycle, from allocating resources to leveraging resources, which is the way activity in the infrastructure space has gone. And in doing that, we want to focus on these 4 bits on the cycle. 1 is on value for money, 2 is on whole of life of the project, 3 is on whole of government and whole of nation, and 4 is about differentiating between financing and funding, but thinking about both of them as reinforcing each other. And there again, we want to see this as a reinforcing virtuous cycle. So let's first of all focus on value for money. Value for money is a little bit imprecise as a term. It can be determined by where you sit, and perspectives can differ. So if you sell an asset at a poor price, that's a bad value for money outcome for the seller, but maybe a good one for the purchaser. Number one. Number two, government tends to control many aspects of value for money. So user fees, for instance, service coordination and facility expansion can all be influenced by regulatory means. They can all directly affect the value for money experience. The way I think that increasingly we're all thinking about value for money is in terms of the five E's: economy, efficiency, effectiveness, equity, and the environment. And thinking about it in terms of over the entire life of the project. And that we're not only talking about costs that are encashed, we're talking about opportunity costs as well. And the net result of all that is it's basically not an easy calculation. It's not an easy calculation ex ante. It may not be an easy calculation even ex post. Sometimes, though, value for money failures are quite apparent. Here's a case of a massive statue that was constructed by an SOE in China. Just the cost of moving that statue cost $24 million, which one would have to say is not great value for money. Now, I mentioned that when we're thinking about value for money, we need to think about the whole of life of the project. The life cycle perspective, as it's sometimes called, needs to consider the following: planning and pre-planning, design, finance, construction, operation, maintenance, and possible disposal, and has to be able to deal through the life of the project with things such as changes in taste, relative prices that might lead to some strandedness. Coal-fired power stations, for instance, the value of which may decline quite rapidly as countries decide to move out of carbon fuels. But also it's important to remember that in the task of estimation, there can be many distortions or deviances relative to the intended outcome. And one of the important ones is to ensure or to back up the plan with a path of execution, and that the Treasury in particular has an important role in ensuring that that's the case. Now, one of the complications about many of these assets is that they do span many economic and political cycles. Take a bridge. Bridges typically survive for 80 years, but they can span from 25 to 100 or even longer. The Brooklyn Bridge, which I have a nice picture of down the bottom, was built in 1883. And just in terms of thinking of the benefit of the Brooklyn Bridge, when it opened, it had 9 million people per day cross it. As of a couple of years ago, it had 40 million vehicle crossings a day. And at its peak in the early parts of this century, it was at 50 million vehicle crossings. Now, clearly, when considering the net present value estimations for the Brooklyn Bridge in 1868 or so, just as construction was about to begin, it would have been impossible to have thought through to the 50 million vehicle crossings per day that were going to occur at the beginning part of the 21st century. Pumping stations go for 50 years. Skate parks. The first skate park in the world that I know of was, I think, 1965 in Texas. So they exist for between 50 and 80 years. But road pavements, which are notoriously uneven, if you forgive the pun, span for 20 to 120 years. So the point is here is that whilst we are encouraged and encourage looking at the whole of life is can be quite a difficult thing to capture. Now let's move on from the life to thinking about the whole of government. So we really thought about the whole of community perspective from value. We're thinking about the whole of project in terms of time. Now we're thinking about the whole of government. The reality is many governments struggle with getting a very joined-up view of what they do. We did some work a few years ago looking particularly at ministries of finance, and that's shown by the graph on the right-hand side. At lower income countries, there tends to be a lot of contestation about resource allocation. As countries get a bit richer, they tend to centralise that central finance function a bit more. And then when they get richer still, and the central processes at the heart of government are working better, they can afford to specialise. So the specialisation leads in part to some degree of deconcentration. The difference is at low income levels, the centre of government functions don't work so well. At higher income levels, they might work better. Now, in thinking about getting process across the whole of government, it is important to note that the whole of government doesn't really map very well to statistical models of the government sector. And that's it's also important to note, associated with that the general government sector and the central government sector may in fact not comprise the majority of infrastructure spending. So down the bottom, I've tried to characterise the subgroupings that really comprise government across the three-tiered government structure of central, state and local. Now that is quite different from the way GFS depicts the structure of the public sector, but I think this relates much more to responsibility and accountability. Now, in moving from contested, perhaps a narrow focus in government to a more whole of government and perhaps whole of nation perspective, we should remember what Aaron Wildowski, the sort of father of budgeting, pointed out, which is no significant change can be made to the budgetary process without affecting the political process. So clearly, if you're bringing in more parts of the state, you are bringing in more players from the political process as well. Now, in thinking about the whole of government and the whole of nation, it's also important to take account of the costs associated with financing and costs associated with funding. Now, financing and funding are somewhat different. Financing relates to the capital cost of the project, whereas funding really relates to the resources required and the access to those resources to keep the services being delivered from the asset in question. About 10 years ago, a little over, the Australian Productivity Commission did a report on financing for infrastructure. They pointed out that there are really two broad categories for the public sector in accessing financing. There's what they call pay-go, and there is accessing capital markets. So pay-go, they say, is really mainly about current operating incomes, particularly from the collection of taxes and service charges, but may also involve, say, specific levies such as development contributions, reserves set aside in general or specific investment purposes, proceeds from asset sales, and intergovernmental transfers. In a sense, that's really caught there on the left-hand side of the diagram above general revenue, with costs being between administrative costs, the opportunity costs of funds, which I mentioned before, and contingent liabilities associated with projects which invariably fall on taxpayers. Then on the right-hand side, the PPP arrangement, which is basically accessing capital markets through the private sector. The Productivity Commission identified costs associated with transactions, associated with return on debt and equity that's required by the private partners, and finally also on the contingent liability for taxpayers. But this financing is somewhat different from funding. So here I just list a number of the financing types and the funding types. It is, as I mentioned before, important to remember that very typically the financing occurs outside the general government sector. Just turning briefly to funding, down the bottom of that box, there are two sources there which sometimes are well, not necessarily forgotten, but not given the credence they could. One is that swapping out of higher cost and environmentally damaging fuels into lower cost and less environmentally damaging fuels does create a sort of a funding dividend that can be applied for other purposes. And the bottom point there is putting lazy assets to work. This is a point that DAG Data has been making for some time, that there are a lot of assets, particularly real estate assets, that government holds that could be earning a return or be put to better use more generally. If that is the case, those assets will create or can create a flow of funds or a saving which can be devoted for another purpose. So what are some of the steps that we're seeing across countries in thinking about this micro set of actions around value for money, whole of life, whole of government, and financing and funding, and the macro being government investment, capital, output, revenue. So first of all, I think because of the size and complexity of the PIM system, countries find it advantageous to really focus on a small number of actions, 2 or 3 perhaps at one time, breaking them down to see where the real constraints are to efficient allocation. Secondarily, it's really emboldening the Ministry of Finance around value for money, making sure affordability analysis is carried out for all new investments, and that needs to apply also to PPPs because of the complexity of PPPs and the contracting time associated with them, the transaction cost, when we call it that. It can be important to create a centre of excellence, whether that's in the Ministry of Finance or outside. Thirdly, it's applying a climate change and environmental degradation lens to public infrastructure investment so that social sustainability at key points in the PIM system is also taken account of. Fourth, we did talk about improvements in governance having a positive effect on public investment management efficiency. Well, one area of focusing there is on integrity. Fifthly, expertise on project evaluation can sometimes sit outside government, so it's worthwhile for government to make that connection, be it through the IFIs or domestic institutions, to improve the quality of the evaluation that's done. Sixth, it's about managing the national balance sheet. If we're going to think about managing across government, we need to think about the balance sheet as representing the interests of government. That does mean that the SOE sector, non-financial and financial investments and financing need to be aligned with government strategy and sectoral policies. 7, a lot of infrastructure and public investment management and public investment occurs at subnational levels, but often there's more revenue available at the central government level. So the central government can use their comparative advantage in revenue through devices such as viability gap financing and incentive-based payments to improve the quality and the selection of public investment projects at subnational level. 8 is about supporting the whole of the nation. That does mean that the citizenry has to be brought in. Citizens have different sources of information and knowledge about public investment than decision makers often have. A high level of public participation in all stages is important for increasing efficiency and effectiveness. 9, earmarking, which periodically gets a pretty bad name in some public finance texts, can assist funding and can also change the calculus of financing and paybacks. 10, maintenance programs may have faster and larger feedback to the local economy. This is a sort of important point, sometimes hard to make maintenance sound exciting, but coming out of COVID, because of the lower import componentry of maintenance programs, number one, and the higher labour componentry, it means that maintenance programs may be especially important and helpful in having economies grow back and grow back more resilient. And 11, if we go back to that first macro cycle, it is very important to remember the importance. It's very important to remember the centrality of taxation, and that the buoyancy of the tax system means that the gains from public investment can be clawed back and then reapplied to more investment. So we started talking about the horse and cart story. We may have moved on now, and I think we're talking about something that looks a bit like a ball bearing with the outer wheel and the inner wheel. Now, ball bearings have three purposes. They carry load, they reduce friction, and they position many moving parts. So I think it's a very good metaphor for a public investment management system. We started with the macro and the fact that government investment can pay for itself in extreme cases, but certainly pays a fair bit for itself in all cases through higher government revenue. And then we drilled down on the idea that if you improve the governance around government investment, public investment, you get an additional bonus. So in this space, the World Bank is very active. We support better planning, execution, accounting of public investments through our analytical work, through our lending, prior actions, and P4R indicators, and the fact that we have many clients who are state-owned enterprises. We also support countries on the tax side. We're in more than 100 countries, and we also are involved in the global debates, and we try to support developing countries to exercise their voice in those global debates. We've been part of the moves on debt transparency, partly with the fund, but also on our own account. And particularly through our Singapore office, we support operationally the private finance agenda. You know, I had the joy, the pleasure about 10 years ago to be involved in the establishment of PEMNA. I think these communities, the BCOP, the TCOP, the plenary, have a great deal to offer. I think it really is about getting together and sharing knowledge, sharing information, and learning practices. With that, I'll close. Thank you.